Last person to be publicly executed by the guillotine, Eugene Weidman, by Brooke Johnson. The guillotine was one of the most popular forms of execution for capital crimes in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The first model of the guillotine was assembled in the year of 1792, and it would take its first life that same year when Nicolas Jacques Pelletier was executed for his crimes of assault, robbery, and murder. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, who was the founder of this machinery, had the idea to create a civilized yet effective way of carrying out capital punishment. The guillotine was not meant to cause pain upon its victim. However, it was very much meant to catch the eye of anyone who might be considering committing a heinous crime. In modern ages, the guillotine would most likely be considered a barbaric way of execution, which is one of the reasons that execution by guillotine was squandered in 1981. For many years, execution by guillotine was one that crowds would swarm to observe. The very last public execution was on June 17, 1939, when a man named Eugene Weidman was put to death for committing multiple murders. This is his story. Today, I'd like to dive into the life of the last man to ever be publicly executed by the guillotine, Eugene Weidman. I'll take you through his childhood, all the way up to his maturing into adulthood, and eventually his development into a cold-blooded killer. Eugene was born in 1908 in the town of Frankfurt, Germany. His parents described him as a gracious young child, and he was loved by them very much. However, when Eugene was just 5 years old, he was sent to live with his grandparents at their home in Colonia. His father had recently been mobilized with the Kaiser Army, and his mother had to return to work, rendering them unable to watch after Eugene during this time. Eugene was used to the loving nature of his parents, and when he went to live with his grandparents, he no longer received the love and attention he once felt. Because of this, he started acting out by committing small acts of thievery. When he would visit with friends or other family members, they would notice that their own children would come back with cuts and bruises on their faces. Adults around him would find that they were missing money, among other things. Eventually, his mischief was brought to school with him. His teachers would describe him as someone who was twisted yet friendly. He was eventually sent to reform school where he would stay for only 1 year before becoming even more mischievous and troublesome. Eugene's psychiatrist described him as an unbalanced, superior degenerate whose decision-making capacity relies on eccentric ideas, someone who is deeply self-centered and lacks sensitivity. He was an avid reader who loved to spend his days with his nose in a book. However, instead of veering toward the heroes of the story like most children would, Eugene had a tendency to admire the darker side of the characters. He thought that they were like him, that they had two faces, and that success was achieved through mischief and dirty tricks. Eugene's twisted and disobedient nature did not stop at his childhood days. As he grew older, he knew that he wanted to get out of Germany. Having grown up in the time when Hitler was in power, he had seen some of the greatest evil that ever existed. He was on a mission to make his way to the United States, but since he couldn't obtain a visa, he found himself ending up in Canada, where he lived among people who could be described as good Christian families. They gave him a job and helped him with housing. Eventually, he came down with pneumonia, and after being hospitalized, something in him was different. What seemed like a time that he might be turning the page and growing into a decent individual was soon clouded by his lack of judgment. He began stealing yet again, but this time he was stealing from the very man who helped him and gave him a job. He was sent to jail for robbery, and it was during this time that he learned about a new technique called snatch racket. His cellmates told him about this technique, which involved kidnapping and ransom. Once out of jail, he returned to Germany, where he would soon find himself getting into more trouble, landing him a spot in prison. The Great Depression was driving its way through Germany, and since he had no means of making a living, he turned to burglary. While in prison, he was described as a model inmate. He never got into trouble, and made it a point to stay away from those who did. He also befriended two Frenchmen by the names of Roger Million and John Blanc, who were doing time for money laundering. The three of them devised a plan to move to France, where they would open a beauty school to be used as a cover-up for their kidnapping and ransom activities. They moved to a suburb of Paris called St. Cloud. The city was known for its wealth, which made it a perfect place to commit these acts of kidnapping and ransom. Eugene's first victim would be a woman named Jean de Coven. She was a young dancer from New York who found a friend in Eugene. The two of them enjoyed a night of drinking at Eugene's villa. He eventually used chloral hydrate to make her pass out. When she awoke, she immediately tried to escape. But before she could, Eugene woke up, and after a few moments of fighting, he strangled her. Although he found a decent amount of money on her, it wasn't enough for Eugene. He went on to commit his second murder on a man named Joseph Kofi. He lured him into a nearby forest, where he shot and robbed him of his money, his car, and his life. His third victim was Janine Keller, a nurse who he also lured into the forest, where he shot her in the back of the head, stole her money, and her diamond ring. The three of them, Weidman, Blanc, and Million, promised a producer named Roger Leblond that they would invest in his productions, but during their meeting with him, Eugene shot him and took 5,000 francs out of his wallet. His next victim was actually an old prison mate of Eugene's. Fritz Frommer was shot in the back of the head and buried next to Jean de Coven, his first victim. Eugene has always had a hunger for money, and his desire to kill seemed to be growing quickly. It was not even a week later that he would kill his final victim, the one who finally caused Eugene to be caught. His name was Raymond Le Sober, and he was a real estate agent who made quite a good living for himself. He too was lured with a business meeting where Weidman shot and robbed him. Detectives had been keeping a close eye on Eugene's villa for a while now, and when he murdered his last victim, suspicion arose. Two detectives confronted Eugene at his villa after they found his address on a business card at the office of the real estate agent who had now been reported missing. The two detectives did not want Eugene to know who they were, so they pretended to be tax agents. Upon entering his home, Eugene became nervous and pulled out a gun and began shooting at the detectives after they finally revealed themselves as law enforcement. It started out as a struggle, but the two of them acted quickly and were able to knock him out and bring him into custody. During interrogation, the police stated that they had never come across such a sensitive killer. He gave all the details regarding his murders, and even seemed remorseful about some of them. Once he had given them all the details of his victims, he almost looked relieved, as if he was finally at peace. The judge assigned to Weidman's case believed that he had a personality like Jekyll and Hyde. This aligns right up with the way Eugene described himself as a child, having two sides, two different personalities. He was reviewed by psychiatrists who warranted him responsible for his actions and was sentenced to the death penalty. His lawyer did try to make a case for him by claiming that since he grew up in a family of German Nazis, he was used to violent context and in turn was just a product of his environment. This, however, was not enough to keep him from execution. On June 17, 1939, Weidmann was guillotined in front of the entrance of the Versailles prison. While executions are usually performed at 3:30 a.m., Eugene's was scheduled at 4:30. The sun had already risen, allowing many pictures to be taken and even videos to be filmed. The crowd at his execution was not only large, but even included some very well-known people who were famous at the time. There were even reports of women hurling themselves near him to dab their handkerchiefs with his blood. His execution was heavily reported by the media, making it exaggerated. The whole experience was meant to be terrifying. It was so grim that the abolition of the public execution by guillotine took place only 1 week after the public display. On June 24, 1939, the Prime Minister issued a decree making all executions done only within the prison walls. Eugene Weidmann was buried in a local cemetery with an anonymous grave rather than the usual common grave, with help from a girlfriend he met while in prison.